Welcome back. Hope you've got your cup of coffee or tea, because it's time for a very healthy conversation on the economy. Of course, time and again, we turn our focus lens on the administration's economic policies, and for good reason. How is it playing out well for you? And speaking of which, time now for our question of the day. So here's our question of the day for you. Have President Tinubu's economic policies worked for Nigeria? Have President Tinubu's economic policies worked for Nigeria? That's our question of the day for you. So go to all our platforms and start responding already. WhatsApp number will be showing on your screen very soon. You can also comment on X, hashtag CTV Morning Brief. What are your thoughts? You can do a yes or no with an explainer, brief explainer. You also know that we like to bring a summary, a recap of the yeses and the no's as far as the question of the day is concerned. A healthy feedback that the administration needs, of course, to further plan for the economy. Speaking of which, that's where we're headed. The IMF has expressed concern about Nigeria's high inflationary threat and advised on what can be done to address this. Now, let's have this conversation this morning, and we have joining us Dr. Tokwe Fashua. He's a special advisor to President Bola Tinubu on economic affairs. He joins us from our Abuja studio. We also have Professor Adeola Adenikinju. He's the president of the Nigeria Economic Society and professor, Department of Economics, University of Ibadan. He joins us virtually via Zoom from Abuja. Gentlemen, a very good morning to you, and thank you so much for joining us on the program.
Good morning. Thanks for the invite.
I'm going to start with you, Dr. Fashua. The IMF is preferring solutions to Nigeria's inflation. Of course, it is acknowledging that indeed the subsidy has gone through and there are increased savings. But let me, just cite briefly from the statement of the IMF. It says, the fund says, for now, the share of revenue that goes to interest spending leaves too little for investment in people and infrastructure. It is therefore critical that the substantial financial savings from the removal of subsidies flow to the government to fund priority spending. And doesn't this leave a huge question mark on subsidy savings that the government keeps touting, that indeed more funds have gone through to the subnationals as a result of subsidy savings? But questions are being asked now, not just by the opposition or economic experts, but even by the Bretton Woods Institution about subsidy savings. How do you respond, Dr. Fashua?
Well, thank you very much, and thanks for the invite. Sometimes one wants to think that the IMF, we're talking about the IMF specifically here, they go into an overdrive sometimes, and it's like almost every week or every 2-3 days there's a statement on Nigeria. This sort of heckling, and at the end of the day, it leaves everybody in a state of confusion. I mean, they are the lenders themselves. I mean, that's an institution that we paid $3 billion a few weeks ago, exiting their COVID package, which most other countries have not been able to exit. So we're not asking for their parts in the back, really. We're just saying, you know what, let's have a breather to even be able to implement the policies. Of course, they acknowledge that the reforms are good. They want more reforms. Just last week, or earlier this week, I saw another advisory or a statement from them saying that they are aware that their policies or their statements are unpopular in Nigeria. Yeah, so, I mean, it's like we caught between the deep blue sea and a rock, because on one hand, the statements kind of pitch government or pitch the people against the government. On the other hand, they are there also making all sorts of, grandstanding. So, look, in fact, the first statement you made, the question you posed to the people, is those kind of questions that actually give a false narrative, because you're asking the people 2 years into a government whether the policies have been good for them or not. That's not the question. It's not a nuanced question. because it's like a house is really, really dilapidated. And then we're talking about having all the full comforts within 2 years. When you have to remove the roof, you know, you have to even do something on the foundation and all of that. This administration under President Tinubu has done some of the deepest reforms that we've seen in a while. I mean, we only just got the tax bill signed into an act. And that tax bill, a pro-poor tax bill that gives a good break to people who are earning very little amounts of money, that actually increases by 100% the threshold for tax-free for small businesses. We haven't even allowed it to even gestate, to even germinate, to even settle down. And then we're having all sorts of statements and all sorts of final, you know, very fatalistic statements from different places, including, unfortunately, the IMF. So I don't know, because of course the IMF, they also have an advisory business, apart from a lending business. Sometimes it looks like the advisory is clashing with the lending. We don't know which one to believe, you know. So I would think that the statement went into an overdrive. Whereas they acknowledge that we have done the right thing, they want more of the things that will hurt the people, and the government has a right to say, you know what, give us a break, let us see how this one pans out. We don't have to pitch against the people too badly, let people breathe. Like the president would say, let the poor breathe. So this is the point where we are. Honestly, sometimes this statement makes one feel like they're overrated. We should actually go get our own data ourselves, rather than running to some of those with decisions all the time. Get our own data ourselves, invest in our own data ourselves, and have our data sovereignty. Thank you.
I can understand your frustration with the remarks of the IMF or the question, but these questions must be asked. You are accountable to the people. That's on one hand. So let me speak for the question we asked. Section 14 of the Constitution says that sovereignty belongs to the people. That is how government derives its power, through the Constitution. And if you put out a neoliberal policy, whatever explanation you have to give for that neoliberal policy, well, that is, with the greatest sense of respect, the government's kettle of fish. It's how the people experience that lived-in experience. So we constantly need to ask this question. Of course, there will be people that will say, the levers in some aspects in terms of the macroeconomic data and indicators and maybe all of that is moving certainly in some right direction, stability in the currency and all of that. But lived-in experience, like you and I will agree, has not trickled down in terms of compounding effect. So it is a relevant question today. It was a relevant question 1 year ago. It will be a relevant question 3 years ago, 3 years from now. So it's constantly a relevant question, and we'll continue to ask those questions. But again, where I'm going to with all of this, so the fact that the IMF has written their statement, when they applauded the government, it became something that everybody within the system was celebrating, that, look, even the international organization, I remember when the summit was done, it was one of the things I think the governor of Imo State referenced, that even the international organization has said these reforms are necessary. So if they say that some of these reforms are really biting hard and the gaps are widening, something has to be done so that the reforms, the intention of the reforms will not be achieved, or will end up not being achieved. Is that not a relevant proposal?
Well, unfortunately, they have recommended even more painful reforms. You know, that's why it doesn't jive, right? So, because if you are saying that, okay, two things they've recommended. They recommended even more painful reform. They want, if they could, that we should continue to increase interest rates. Interest rates are a bit stable now. The central bank has a view to begin to reduce interest rate, reducing the MPR pretty soon. Inflation, they complain about inflation. Do you want us to get to a point where it comes to single digits in a quarter? No, it cannot. But inflation has been reducing for the past 3 months, and will reduce some more as we go along. What do they want? I mean, whoever wrote that statement is not sounding like an economist, because an economist is not a fantasist. That's a fantastic statement that they just made, expecting things to just turn around. But anyhow, look, there's also politics involved in some of this. Economics and politics cannot be divorced. I've been reading a lot about the Indian economy, how India managed to remove 58 million people from the poverty list in the last couple of years, and now India is projecting itself to be be the fourth most equal country in the world. Of course, we know India is a class society. How can it be? Of course, some of the private sector people are also in India also moving against that. So that was how they were able to dump it on us that we're now the country with the biggest number of poor people in the world. We need our own data, and we need to invest in our own data. That's the way forward. Data sovereignty. The reason why you cannot disparage China is because they have their own data sovereignty. So look, I mean, you cannot be talking about, that we have done quite a bit of reforms. Then you now swing around to say, you know what, inflation is still is too high and all of that. Spending is this, and then you're now saying we should do even more of those policies that you yourself acknowledged just last week, that your opinions and your statements are unpopular in Nigeria, and they were worried in that statement that, look, going forward, the prospects of IMF in a country like Nigeria, especially Nigeria, they know that these things are unpopular on the street. So look, let me tell you, this is why, first of all, this is why there's a government in every country. As much as I read quite a lot, I don't see the IMF throwing out statements every other week about United States or even about India, about any other country in the world. There's this fixation, Nigeria. And I know that they are, let me land on this. I also know that their local team seem to have a more nuanced view about the Nigerian economy than the guys who sit in Washington. I mean, they had to apologize to Senator Jimo Ibrahim in the last spring meeting when they're just rolling out some of this. Give us a break. Let us be able to know where we're going with a particular policy before coming at us at every angle and generally throwing us off whack. Thank you very much.
Well, Dr. Fasua, quite a lot of things packed into this conversation, and I understand, yes, there may be all the nuances, the politics of things, but we can take the recommendations and really look at ourselves and say, well, it may not be comfortable, but the truth is the truth in terms of the figures. And I'll naturally take this to Professor Adeola Adenikinju and touch on some of the major points that were made in that statement. In fact, the Labour Party presidential candidate in 2023 also spoke to some of the issues around borrowing, and the IMF talks about, the share of revenue that goes into interest spending leaves too little for investment in people and infrastructure. It talks about effective budget framework and the kind of budget assumptions that we make. The IMF says, well, they need to be realistic such that you can now use that budget to invest in people rather than make budget assumptions that are big, and when it comes, it under-delivers. So, Prof, I imagine you looked at that statement, you've looked at previous statements, and you've looked at the Nigerian situation. Do we throw away the baby with the bathwater in this case? Is there nothing that is true about it?
Thank you very much, Kayode. I think I want to agree with you that, look, it's very important to actually distill, the message. As an economist, I mean, you look at what they are saying. You look at the data which Dr. Fasua has mentioned. You look at reality on ground, and then you ask yourself, these recommendations or the observations, are these observations true? Is the recommendation flowing from the observation? And are there things we can learn? I mean, we don't have to agree with the IMF, and we don't even need the IMF to tell us any of these issues. But the reality of the Nigerian system today is that there's a lot of maybe truism in what they have said, because you look at it, for instance. You look at the budget and the assumptions that underline the current budget. And in fact, a very large extent, it's going to be difficult to implement that budget. Okay, because all those assumptions have been thrown into, it's extremely difficult to actually implement them. The price of oil has collapsed. Okay, inflation rate was still a little bit above the assumption in the budget. The volume of oil has gone, is not realistic, or it's not been, global economy is also in a lot of uncertainties and there's macro instability all over the place. So the budget is, the assumptions of the budgets, and people said it at that time, that there's a need to be very careful about this budget. And so with the reality of what is going on now, really, I would assume that, there should be a way of either, revising that budget. to ensure that the budget is in alignment with, with reality. Because if you need to spend, against a budget that the revenue projections may not be realistic, then you're going to have more problems in the sense that, your budget deficit will go up. You then have to borrow more, and that has a lot of implications on the economy. Now, that is very fragile. That, look, keep the budget reigning, your budget expenditure or management in a way that, you're able to deliver good for the people. So in my view, I think that makes sense. Now, so what we need to do, again, I had the opportunity of speaking to the Senate, appropriation committee, in the course of that passage of the budget. That, look, it's that time that, they also have a system in place where, again, data modeling is done to ensure that you're going to probe the assumptions, okay, and to see that what will be the impact of this budget on inflation, on growth, on unemployment, and so on and so forth. So that you don't take hook, line, and sinker everything that you get from the executive. The executive may mean well, but you, as a representative of the people, should also have a framework that allow you to have an evidence-based framework to judge whether the budget is well. So that, like, where we are now, really, there has to be conversation going on about what to do about the budget. So when if you then, you don't realize the revenue and you don't cut your expenditure, and then, as we are seeing now, debt is increasing, public debt is increasing. And that is part of the underlying cause of inflation in Nigeria. Okay, if you see the liquidity dimension of inflation in Nigeria, you look at, a lot of that is coming from public borrowing, from public, what government is doing. And unfortunately, the whole economy is then punished, you see. So it is very important that has been a weakness, not just under this government. The government has done a lot, in terms of, some of the policies in place. But the reality is that deficits continue to be a concerning issue, and that has a lot of implications, macroeconomic implications, okay, including inflation, okay. So what the IMF has said, like I said, it doesn't matter who has said it. Even local economists will say it, that it's important to align public, budget management in Nigeria. Given all the circumstances that we have, the external factors, the global economy is, is a lot of uncertainties, instabilities around that. Domestically, we also have issues, and therefore it's very important that the budget is managed in such a way that it doesn't also exacerbate, some of the problems that we have in the country.
Dr. Fasha, I'd like you to respond to some of the concerns that Professor Aide has raised, the deficit, the debt, and specifically concerns have been raised about this administration borrowing the country into a pit, especially if there have been, subsidy savings, increased funding to the subnationals. Why does the administration still need to resort to borrowing?
Well, I don't know. I'm also very concerned about some of the extreme statements that's been put out in the media, just as you have just said, for borrowing this country into a pit or something of that sort. I mean, the debt of this country reduced by 14 billion in 2024 from 2023. So to a large extent, I don't see where you saw the country being borrowed into a pit. However, because of the recalibration of the exchange rate, the naira amount of the debt went up. It is totally wrong. I mean, I also heard Mr. Peter Obi saying something of that sort. Clearly, except we're not dealing with numbers here. So, yes, the naira value of the debt went up, but in dollar terms, the debt has actually been going down. And I think that we have actually done quite a good work in terms of debt management, given the fact that, look, this week, I understand the NBS, Bureau for Statistics, will release our real GDP. We've been working on a devaluation devalued GDP because of the same naira recalibration and the depreciation of the naira. We're a $350 billion, $400 billion economy. We're running on $188 billion now. If we came out with $400 billion, for example, our debt to GDP will be one of the lowest in the world at below 25%. And any country that's actually borrowing at 25% of their GDP is on the road to nowhere. That means you don't have dreams for your people. So my very senior colleague and my professor, Professor Aide, who's my teacher, has actually concentrated on the 2025 budget. He has made some very valid statements. But one of the things I also need to educate us on is this: that Nigeria actually has one of the lowest budgets per capita in the world. Nigeria's total budget is probably the budget of Johannesburg and Cape Town in South Africa alone, which are 2 territories. Okay? The budget of Johannesburg, the last time I checked several years ago, was at least about $5 billion. How much is Nigeria's total budget? About $35 billion or below. You know, so whereas we're enjoying a certain advantage, and I've been saying this on the PPP and on terms of the purchasing power parity, how far a dollar can go in Nigeria versus how it will go in United States or even in most parts of Africa. Nigeria is even a cheaper country to live than Ghana. Not to talk of Kenya, not to talk of South Africa, because of the things we do for ourselves and the fact that Nigeria is an economy in Africa where many indigenous actually are leading the economy. Dangote was listed as the biggest manufacturer in Africa in the recent report that I read. You know, so therefore we're at the forefront of running our own economy. In other parts in South Africa, you know what their problem is: largest inequality in the world, you know, and so on and so forth. So we haven't even started in terms of our budget. Yes, we are running deficit because most growing economies will run deficit. Even developed economies are running deficit. We're just coming from a 2020 COVID, 2020, 2021, 2022, we're gone. Economies are shut in. And so you have to, if you don't borrow, how will you develop? How will you? And of course, one of the ways of reducing inflation, which the IMF is concerned about, is actually developing your infrastructure. When you do the roads, the cost of transportation will go down. Where we live in Abuja here, and you know, Professor Aide is in Abuja, you say, if I get to some places in Abuja, I'm lost because infrastructure is exploding. And of course, we ask, where is the subsidy that was removed? Go to the states. Their allocations have gone up by ×3. And many of them, I must tell you, many of them have woken up and are doing great infrastructure. Just yesterday, Enugu State government launched its own airline. That's something. Infrastructure is developing. Even when they say, why are states building airports? It's part of the infrastructure stock. When you go to Brazil, they have more than 3,000 airports in the whole of Brazil. Local governments have airports in Brazil. Local governments. So, listen, I think the thing to talk about is that, look, most Nigerians must be able to imagine a better Nigeria. So when we say, let's go and shrink the budget, let's reduce expenditure, that will be because we don't want to live where we are. If we want to live where we are, we're going to take bold moves and explode our infrastructure so that our people will need a totally different life. So of course, even the IMF report talked about electricity. I would think that, look, we've done a lot about electricity on the grid and all of that. A lot of investment goes in there. A lot of the infrastructure in that sector are actually rusty. Some of them have been there 60, 70 years, since when the colonialists were in this country. Perhaps we should begin to look at alternative sources, and the government should be able to add whatever it does in the alternative to what it has generated with the grid. So we're not just running around 5,800 or whatever. Add whatever you do through rural electrification on alternative to that, and we can present a better picture about the economy. So in my view, I don't think our budget is too big. I think it's actually too small. I think we should budget in a lot more, okay, because it's down to what gets to the people.
Dr. Vaswa, I think your points are noted. It's about ambition over ambition and the reality of being able to fund this budget. There's no point driving being ambitious if there's nothing to scale it in terms of production to be able to fund the budget in the first place. So let's look at the number.
Are we then saying we should remain? Are we saying we should then remain in the same spot?
But we're driving
no, that's not leadership.
Up.
That's not governance. No, we're not going to be defined. What's the name? We're not going to be defined by our past. We will not be defined by our past because we have a future to aspire to.
The point you're making, at the end of the day, when those GDP numbers come, rebase hopefully by Friday or so, we're going to look at the two sides of the coin, because it's a two-edged sword at the end of the day. Because on one hand, when you're looking at the numbers in terms of economics, you have to look at, there's going to be some part that will be positive and then the negative part. And then if there is a gap in the market, if you look at the GDP per capita, whether there is also a market in the gap, which is a term you're quite familiar with. So those are the things that we're talking about in terms of lived-in experiences of people. So the numbers are being touted in terms of fact revenue that has increased unarguably across the subnationals.
Can I answer that?
Yeah, no,
can I answer that, please? Can I answer that very briefly?
We'll come back to you, Dr. Fashua, since you've been talking. Let's take it to Prof.
Okay, I'll answer when you come back. Thank you.
Prof, I think we need your intervention on this particular one. I'm more interested again, besides whether the budget, nominally, just looking at it on the surface level, our budget is small. But we can't just say our budget is small and then jack it up because we feel we're a big nation when we can't accommodate as much revenue as possible. Even from Muhammadu Buhari's time, revenue was a problem. I want you to help us close that gap, Prof.
Okay, thank you very much. I think there's a lot of, areas that I agree with Dr. Fashua, in terms of, and I made a point also, revenue per capita, expenditure per capita, we are one of the lowest, okay? But then the issue we have to also address, which is what the point Jeff is also trying to make, is that, look, how do we expand, government, is it revenue, is expenditure, public expenditure. We have to also look at, some of the, infrastructure that has been provided, some of these other, areas of the transition. And by the way, a lot of people are of the opinion, and that the efficiency of government expenditure, the direction of government expenditure, the over-bloated, nature of some of the government expenditure are also there. So it's also it's not just to have expenditure; it's to also look at what is the direction of that expenditure. What are you spending money on? Like Riley said, government borrow. But then the question is, when you are borrowing, you are asking yourself, what am I spending this money on? What will be the impact of this expenditure on area of macroeconomic outcomes? Two, what will this expenditure, will you be able to repay will be able to repay back? So there are a number of questions that will follow that. But more importantly, I think that's the direction that the government mentioned, and it's what's also in our development plan, is to how do we unlock, this economy for the private sector. Okay. Now, one of the things I've observed, because if you look at all the, the debt instrument that government is rolling out, the treasury bills, the government debt stock and low and the bonds, you have oversubscription. Okay. People, so there's a lot of money, resources that are locked in the private sector. Domestically and externally don't want to come into this economy. And the question with government should be asked is, how do I unlock this really, that these guys can go into the productive sector of the economy to invest this money without it coming to me? Okay, because we know, and I think that there's some broad agreement in terms of who is more efficient in terms of spending. For every $1 you spend in the private sector, $1 you spend in the public sector, what is the relative efficiency of that? Okay, so what we have now, which unfortunately is also, part of what I fear, is that there's some less investment, direct investment by the private sector, including the banks. The banks now, if you look at their books, they are doing less than lending to the public. They rather will buy these government instruments where they make money. Okay. And then so there's a crowding out that is going on from that process. Apart from the fact that excess debts also have its own, also have some of the, some issues around, we are not yet there. But again, we have to be very careful the direction that we are going. that this will not come back to haunt us. You don't know government that will come in after Tinubu, and how that efficient that government will be, and therefore you're going to have what was the issue in the past, where repayment became an issue, and then we have to go to the parties, all those issues that then come. So it's very important that now that yes, we must find a way of delivering on a whole lot of, I don't know what to call it, freedom of democracy. There are a whole lot of things that Nigerians need.
Right.
But the question is, should government be doing this? Should we open up the space? Do we create incentives for the private sectors to come in and do it more efficiently so that government can concentrate on what it can do best?
Right.
Security and some of these other things, and there's some big infrastructure as it were.
Clearly, we need all of the investment we can get. Maybe we'll get to the conversation around whether or not that would exacerbate inflation or not, with all of the development economic theories and all of that. But Dr. Fasua, let's let you have the final one on this. We have just about a minute to anchor. So you say 2 years rather is too early to rate this government. We all agree that the reforms, very high stakes reforms. They have deepened poverty, inflation, they have raised inflation. We agree on all those issues. I mean, we can see the naira to the dollar. That, of course, has its ripple effect on our market and the purchasing power of Nigerians. We all agree on that. So when is the right time? Because you've said 2 years is not enough. So when should we begin to say, well, now is a time we should reap this? If you say 2 years is not enough, you have to give us something, Dr. Fasua. Let's wind down on that.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Kay. Thank you very much, Kay. And what I'll say is perhaps that you give us a year and let's see what happens in this next year. As we close on the 3rd year, let's do another analysis. Remember, I'm a member of Taiwo Idele's tax committee, and we met for over a year doing serious work. Especially Taiwo himself, profound work. This is the kind of, the Buhari government was here and Jonathan government, all of them, they would usually complain about revenue issues. For the first time, the government has now done something tangible about reordering the revenue so that the revenue can spike, and this is where we are. So if you look at the body of that, in fact, the total reorganization of the tax, whatever, the only thing which is part of why IMF is not happy is that the government did not go ahead with VAT increase to 10%. We say, okay, let's keep it at 7.5. Let's observe, because the sentiment of the people is not amenable to such a thing. Remember also that the states were able to pay down 32% of their global debts in 2024. I don't know how they did it, but 32% of the state's debts disappeared in 2024. Only 3 states borrowed, Enugu State, I think Rivers State, and one more state, Niger State, borrowed in 2024. But now some of them are beginning to borrow, trying to take on new projects, and that's it. Lastly, I will say, there's a new economy out there, okay? There's a new economy out there which we must actually understand that some things are totally different and really changing now. Spotify paid Nigerians 85 billion naira in 2024. Where is the money? It's gone down. Professor Aide mentioned that there seems to be money in the private sector. All bonds get...
Oh, there. And that's the high point of Dr. Fashua's explainer. I think he's back. Go ahead, Dr. Fashua. Land on the point we're making.
Yes. Okay, yes. We must understand the economy. In the first place, Spotify paid.
All right, Dr. Fasua, thank you very much. Sadly, we cannot conclude on your explainer there, but the points that you have made about a growing economy is valid. But as we say, there remains a disconnect between the advances made in the economic performance of the administration and the experience of the people, and that's why it's important to keep having this conversation about the performance of the Tinubu administration on the economy. And it's Also valid to ask the question to a household who takes over leadership of a household. After 2 years, we still do not have the promised provision. So our question of the day remains valid. We've been talking with Dr. Tokwe Fashoa, is a special advisor to President Bola Tinubu on economic affairs, who joined us from our Abuja studio. We've also had Professor Adeola Adenikinju, President of the Nigeria Economic Society and Professor, Department of Economics, University of Ibadan, who also joined us virtually from Abuja. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for coming through on this one.
Thank you very much.
And from here, we'll transit to a very important conversation on politics of the Labour Party, especially as it has to do with the position taken by the presidential candidate to identify with the ADC, the newly adopted party by the coalition forces ahead of the 2027 elections. So stay with us for this one. We'll be right back.